The dust of Frontier's bluff was a living thing. It rose in fine, tan-colored clouds with every gust of wind, settled in a gritty film on every windowsill, and coated the tongues of the men who waited with a thirst that even whiskey couldn't entirely quench. On this particular afternoon, the late summer sun beat down with a merciless intensity, baking the single and wide street until the air shimmered above it. The town held its breath, a collective pause in the rhythm of its hard-scrabble life. The semi-weekly stagecoach was due, and this wasn't just any stagecoach. This one carried the mail-order brides. It was an event that drew nearly everyone from their routines. Shopkeepers stood in their doorways, wiping sweaty hands on their aprons. Ranch hands who'd ridden in for supplies lingered near the saloon, their faces a mixture of leering curiosity and feigned indifference. The town's few respectable ladies fanned themselves on the shaded boardwalk of the general store, their eyes sharp with judgment, ready to inspect the new arrivals as if they were bolts of fabric. They were all waiting for the drama, the hope, and the almost certain disappointment that came with these arrangements, a spectacle that broke the monotony of their existence. Inside the rattling, lurching coach, Evelyn Hayes felt every jolt in her bones. For 6 long weeks, this cramped, stuffy box had been her world as it carried her away from the soot-stained skies of the east and deeper into a vast, empty country that seemed to swallow the sun whole. She was 19, though the grief and hardship of the past year had etched a maturity into her features that made her look older. Her hands, resting in the lap of her plain, gray traveling dress, her only dress of any quality, were clenched so tightly her knuckles were white. Tucked into her bodice, a worn, creased letter was a source of both terror and solace. It was from Mr. Alistair Finch, a merchant in Frontier's Bluff. His advertisement in an eastern newspaper had been a beacon in the suffocating darkness that had become her life. The great sickness had swept through her city like a phantom thief, taking her mother, her father, and her younger brother within the space of a month. It had left her utterly alone, with nothing but a handful of coins and a future that looked as bleak and empty as the tenement room she could no longer afford. Mr. Finch's letter promised a new beginning. He wrote of his prosperous general store, of the need for a good, sturdy wife to make a home and be a partner in a growing enterprise. He spoke of the clear, dry air and the boundless opportunities of the West. In return for her passage, he asked for a photograph and an honest account of her character. Evelyn had sent the only photograph she possessed, a small, formal portrait taken 2 years prior, when her face was fuller and her eyes still held the untroubled light of youth. In her reply, written by candlelight with a trembling hand, she had described herself as diligent, virtuous, and of a gentle disposition. She had not lied, but she had omitted the part about the hunger that sometimes gnawed at her belly, and the profound, crushing loneliness that felt like a permanent weight upon her soul. Now, as the coach slowed with a groan of protesting wood and leather, her heart hammered against her ribs. This was it, the final gamble. Mr. Finch was her only hope. There was no one to go back to, nothing to return to. Her entire existence was balanced on the goodwill of a man she had never met. The coach door swung open, and for a moment, Evelyn was blinded by the harsh, unfiltered sunlight. The noise of the street, a low hum of conversation, died instantly. She could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on her as she hesitated on the top step, her hand gripping the iron rail. Slowly, her vision cleared, and she saw them, a sea of weathered faces, all turned toward her. A portly man in a waistcoat that was a size too tight stepped forward. He held a letter in his hand, a match to the one she carried. He was balding, his face flushed red from the heat and, she suspected, from a sense of his own importance. This had to be Mr. Alistair Finch. She took a deep breath, schooling her features into a pleasant, hopeful expression, and carefully descended the steps. The dust puffed up around the hem of her worn boots. She stood before him, a solitary figure in the immense, silent street. Mr. Finch, she asked, her voice smaller than she intended. He did not smile. His eyes, small and critical, traveled over her, from the top of her plainly pinned brown hair, down the length of her slender frame, to the scuffed toes of her shoes. It was not the look of a prospective husband greeting his future bride. It was the appraisal of a rancher inspecting livestock. He held up the photograph she had sent, then looked back at her. A frown creased his fleshy face. "You are not as described in the letter," he said. His voice was loud, carrying easily to the eagerly listening crowd. "The photograph. It is flattering, deceptively so." A ripple of snickers went through the onlookers. Evelyn felt a hot, prickling shame crawl up her neck. Her carefully constructed composure began to crumble. "Sir, the journey was very long," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "I am perhaps not at my best." "You are thin," he interrupted, waving a dismissive hand. "Far too thin. I wrote for a sturdy woman, a woman of good, healthy stock. The West requires fortitude, not fragility." He folded the letter and tucked it into his waistcoat pocket, a gesture of finality. "I am a man of business. Miss Hayes, this is a poor transaction. I have been misled." He said it all so plainly, so publicly, as if she were a faulty piece of merchandise he was returning. The snickers from the crowd grew bolder, turning into outright chuckles and a low murmur of gossip. "But your letter," she whispered, her mind reeling. "You paid my passage. We had an agreement." "An agreement based on a false representation," he declared, puffing out his chest. He turned slightly, addressing the crowd as much as her. "A man cannot be expected to honor a contract when the goods are not as advertised. I withdraw my offer." And with that, he turned his back on her and walked away, disappearing into the cool, dark interior of the general store without a second glance. The world seemed to fall away from beneath Evelyn's feet. The sun beat down, the dust swirled, and the sounds of the crowd washed over her in a cruel wave. Whispers turned to audible comments. "Poor thing. All this way for nothing. Serves her right, trying to fool a man like Mr. Finch. Look at her. She's about to cry." Pity and scorn mingled in the air, each as sharp as a shard of glass. She stood frozen, her small travel bag at her feet, a public spectacle of humiliation. Her hope, which had been a fragile flame she had nurtured across a continent, was extinguished in an instant, leaving behind only the cold ash of despair. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the mocking faces around her. She was stranded, penniless, and utterly alone in a place that was harsher and more unforgiving than she could have ever imagined. She had never felt so naked, so utterly broken. She was vaguely aware that the other women were now stepping out of the coach, being claimed by awkward, sun-darkened men. Life was moving on around her, but she was trapped in her own small circle of shame. She wanted the ground to open up and swallow her whole. It was then that a shadow fell over her. From the corner of her eye, she had been aware of a man leaning against the wall of the blacksmith's shop, half hidden in the shade of the overhang. He had been there the whole time, a tall, quiet presence on the edge of the crowd, watching the proceedings with an unnerving stillness. While the others had craned their necks and whispered, he had remained motionless, his arms crossed over his chest. Now, he was moving. He wasn't a man of the town. His clothes were not the slightly more refined attire of a merchant like Finch, nor the flashy getup of a saloon gambler. He wore simple, durable denim trousers, scuffed leather boots, and a plain, dark cotton shirt, all weathered by sun and work. He was tall, built with the lean, hard strength of someone who spent his days under the open sky. His face was angular and browned by the sun, his dark hair a little too long, and his eyes, when they met hers, were a startlingly deep and unreadable shade of gray. There were lines around them, lines of hardship or sorrow. She couldn't tell which. He looked like he had been carved from the very rock and timber of the unforgiving land around them. The crowd quieted again as he approached, parting for him with a deference they had not shown Mr. Finch. There was an aura about him, an intensity that commanded space without a word. He stopped directly in front of Evelyn, blocking her from the prying eyes of the town. He looked down at her, his expression giving nothing away. He did not offer a smile or a word of comfort. He simply looked, and in his gaze, she did not see pity or contempt, but something else entirely, a quiet, solemn recognition. After a moment that stretched into an eternity, he spoke. His voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together. A voice that was not used to making speeches. He said only 3 words. "Come with me." It was not a question. It was a simple, stark command. Evelyn stared up at him, bewildered. She had no idea who this man was. A rancher, a drifter, a madman? He could be anything. Her mind, still reeling from the public rejection, struggled to make sense of this new development. The crowd was silent now, their mockery replaced by a stunned, gaping curiosity. This was a turn of events no one had expected. The man did not elaborate or explain. He simply stood there, waiting, his gaze holding hers, and then he did something else. He slowly, deliberately, extended his hand. It was a large hand, the skin calloused and scarred, the nails clean but short. It was a hand that knew hard labor, a hand that could fix a fence, calm a horse, or perhaps hold a weapon. It was offered to her, palm up, a lifeline in a sea of despair. For a heartbeat, she hesitated. Every instinct of her careful, sheltered upbringing screamed at her to refuse, to run from this stranger who had appeared from the shadows. But where would she run? Back to the east, with no money and no family. Into the street, to beg for charity from the same people who had just laughed at her downfall. She looked from his unreadable face to his outstretched hand, and then back to the closed door of the general store where her future had died. She had nothing left to lose. Her pride was already in tatters in the dust of this street. All that remained was survival. With a shuddering breath that was half a sob, she reached out and placed her small, trembling hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, firm and surprisingly warm. The contact was a shock, a sudden, grounding anchor in the dizzying shame. Without another word, he turned, his grip on her hand secure, and began to walk. He did not look at the crowd, but his presence was enough to make them step back. Evelyn kept her eyes fixed on the ground, her face hidden by the brim of her bonnet, focusing only on the feel of his strong hand holding hers and the steady, unhurried pace of his boots. They walked the length of the main street, a tall, silent man and a shamed, broken girl, leaving a wake of stunned silence and frantic, whispered speculation behind them. As they turned the corner at the end of the town, leaving the gawking faces and the oppressive heat of Frontier's Bluff behind. Evelyn didn't dare look back. She didn't know where this stranger was taking her, or what awaited her. She only knew that she was walking away from the worst moment of her life, and into an unknown as vast and intimidating as the open wilderness stretching out before them. The silence that fell once they left the last dusty outpost of Frontier's Bluff was more profound than any Evelyn had ever known. It was a living entity, vast and ancient, broken only by the rhythmic plodding of the horse's hooves on the dry, packed earth and the soft creak of saddle leather. The man, Lucas, he had supplied his name in a low murmur when he'd procured a second horse with a few quiet words and a nod to the stable owner, led the way, his back a broad, uncommunicative wall. He had not asked her a single question. He had not inquired about Mr. Finch, her journey, or her now shattered hopes. He simply helped her onto the saddle of a gentle mare, handed her the reins, and set off, assuming she would follow. And she did, because the only other option was to remain in the street and be devoured by the town's cruel curiosity. As the afternoon sun began its slow descent, it painted the landscape in brutal, beautiful strokes of orange and crimson. The world opened up into a panorama of staggering emptiness. Rolling plains of sun-scorched grass, the color of old straw, stretched to the horizon, interrupted by jagged outcrops of dark rock that looked like the bones of the earth itself. In the far distance, mountains rose, their peaks hazy and purple in the fading light. There were no farms, no fences, no sign of human life at all. It was a land that did not care for a person's sorrow. It was too immense, too occupied with its own harsh survival. The initial shock of her public shaming and subsequent rescue began to recede, leaving in its place a cold, creeping dread. The full weight of what she had done settled upon her. She had placed her life, what little was left of it, into the hands of a complete stranger, a man who had looked at her with eyes that held no warmth, who spoke in monosyllables, and who was now leading her into the heart of an unforgiving wilderness. The tears she had held back in the town finally came, but they were as silent as the man in front of her. They slid down her cheeks, carving clean paths through the layers of dust and grime from her long journey. She did not sob or make a sound, letting the grief pour out of her in a quiet, desperate stream. She wept for her lost family, for the foolish, naive hope she had harbored, and for the utter, terrifying uncertainty of her future. What did this man want from her? Was he a good man, driven by a moment of pity, or was he something far worse, a man who preyed on the desperate, taking what the town cast aside? As twilight deepened into a thick, star-dusted darkness, Lucas finally drew his horse to a halt in a small hollow sheltered by a cluster of weathered rocks. He swung down from his saddle with an economy of motion that spoke of long familiarity with the routine. He still did not speak to her. Instead, he took the reins of her mare and tethered both animals to a scrubby, resilient tree. Evelyn slid clumsily from the saddle, her limbs stiff and aching. She stood awkwardly, wrapping her arms around herself, watching as he worked. He moved with a quiet efficiency, gathering dry brush for a fire, his motions sure and practiced in the gloom. Within minutes, a small fire was crackling, its light pushing back the immense darkness and casting flickering shadows against the rocks. From his saddlebag, he produced a small parcel wrapped in cloth. He opened it to reveal a loaf of dry bread and some jerky. He broke off a piece of the bread, handed it to her along with a strip of the dried meat, and then motioned to a water skin hanging from his saddle. His gestures were the only language he used. Then, he unrolled a thick wool blanket and laid it on a patch of ground that was relatively clear of stones. It was a simple bedroll. He placed it a careful, respectful distance from the fire and from where he would eventually lay his own head. He looked at her, then pointed to the bedroll. The message was clear. It was for her. The simple, unspoken provisions were a strange sort of comfort. He had offered no words of kindness, but he had offered her food, water, and a place to rest. It was more than anyone else in this land had given her. She ate the hard bread and chewed the tough meat, the food tasting like ash in her mouth, and drank deeply from the water skin. The cool water was a balm to her raw throat. She laid down on the bedroll, pulling the clean, scratchy blanket up to her chin. The wool smelled faintly of wood smoke and the dry, clean scent of the outdoors. Exhaustion, both of the body and the soul, washed over her, heavier than any blanket. Across the fire, Lucas sat leaning against his saddle, a silhouette against the flames, staring into the darkness beyond their small circle of light. He did not seem to sleep, but merely to watch, a silent guardian over a camp of two lost souls. Evelyn closed her eyes. The image of the silent, watchful man burned into her mind and fell into a dreamless, heavy slumber. The next day's journey was a repeat of the first, long hours of silence under a vast, empty sky. They rode deeper into the wilderness, the terrain growing more rugged and arid. By late afternoon, she was so weary she felt she might slide from the saddle. It was then that he pointed toward the horizon. At first, She saw nothing but a slight dip in the barren plains. But as they drew closer, she could make out the shapes of a few lonely structures. It was a ranch, but it was unlike any farm she had ever seen in the green. Crowded east, there was a long, low cabin built of thick, dark logs, a sturdy-looking barn, and a series of corrals made from rough-hewn timber, and that was all. The building stood alone in a vast sea of brown earth and pale grass, with no other sign of life for miles in any direction. It was the most isolated place she had ever seen. As they rode into the yard, a sense of profound desolation settled over her. This was not a home. It was a fortress against the wilderness, a last bastion at the edge of the world. Lucas swung down from his horse and wordlessly took her reins again. "The well is over there," he said, his first full sentence to her since they'd left town. He pointed toward a stone-lined well with a simple wooden bucket and crank. "Water is for the house first, then the animals. Never waste it." He led the horses toward the barn, leaving her standing alone in the yard. She looked at the cabin. It was stark and functional, with a stone chimney at one end and two small windows that looked like dark, vacant eyes. There were no flowers, no garden path, no softening touches of any kind. It was the home of a man who lived without comfort, who expected nothing from the world but what he could take with his own two hands. When he returned from the barn, he stopped a few feet away from her, his face grim in the harsh afternoon light. "You can stay," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "There is a room inside. It is small, but it is dry." Evelyn swallowed, her throat tight. "Stay as what?" she asked, the question barely a whisper. His gray eyes met hers, and for a moment, she saw a flicker of something. Pain or weariness, or perhaps both. "You will earn your keep," he stated, the words clear and sharp. "You will cook the meals, clean the house, tend the garden out back. The work is hard. I expect it to be done." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "I ask for nothing else. You will not be troubled. I live my life. You will live yours. You do not ask me questions, and you do not pry into my affairs. This room," he gestured toward the far side of the cabin, "and the barn, they are my own. You do not enter them unless I say, 'Am I understood?'" It was not an offer of marriage, or partnership, or even companionship. It was a business arrangement, as cold and practical as the one she had hoped to make with Mr. Finch, though stripped of all pretense. He was offering her shelter and protection in exchange for her labor and her silence. She was to be a housekeeper, a ghost in his solitary existence. She looked around at the vast, empty land, at the desolate cabin, and then back at the hard, closed-off face of the man before her. She had nowhere else to go. No other choice. "Yes," she said, her voice finding a sliver of strength. "I understand." He gave a single, curt nod. "Good. The house is yours to manage. My horse is tired." He turned and strode back toward the barn, leaving her on the packed dirt of the yard. The days that followed fell into a strange, silent rhythm. Evelyn and Lucas lived under the same roof like two strangers who had been forced to take shelter from the same storm. The cabin was larger inside than it appeared, but starkly furnished. There was a main room with a large stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table with two chairs, and a few shelves holding basic provisions. A small, curtained-off alcove served as her room, containing a narrow cot and a wooden crate for her belongings. Mornings began before dawn. She would rise in the chill air, light the fire, and prepare a simple breakfast of coffee and biscuits or oatmeal. He would enter from his room, eat without a word, and then depart for the day, disappearing into the vastness of his land. She would not see him again until dusk. Her days were filled with the hard, physical labor he had promised. She scrubbed the floors, washed their few dishes, fetched endless buckets of water from the well, and tended the small, struggling vegetable patch behind the cabin. She found a rhythm in the work, a way to keep her mind from dwelling on her grief and her fear. She mended his torn shirts, finding a strange intimacy in running her fingers over the seams of clothing worn by a man whose thoughts were a complete mystery to her. They rarely spoke. Communication was reduced to the barest of necessities: a nod, a gesture, a single word. Their conversations were in the things left unsaid. It was in the fresh stack of firewood he left by the door each evening, and in the warm meal she had waiting for him on the table. It was in the brief, accidental meeting of their eyes across the table, a glance that was always broken first by one of them, as if direct contact were a forbidden thing. She learned the contours of his silence, the different shades of his quiet. But at night, the silence would press in on her, in the darkness of her small room, with only the sound of the wind whistling around the corners of the cabin. Her fears would return. The faces from the crowd in Frontier's Bluff would swim in her memory, their laughter echoing in her ears. She would lie awake for hours, her heart pounding, listening to the quiet sounds of the man sleeping in the next room, a man who was both her savior and her jailer. One night, about 2 weeks after her arrival, the nightmares came for her. She was back in the dusty street, standing before Mr. Finch, his face twisted in contempt. But then the crowd began to press in, their faces melting into the pale, feverish masks of her dying family. They were calling her name, their voices full of accusation and sorrow. She was trapped, suffocating, the weight of their judgment and her own grief crushing the air from her lungs. She cried out, a strangled, terrified sound, thrashing against the confines of her cot. The sound shattered the deep silence of the cabin. Suddenly, a heavy, solid presence was beside her. A large hand clamped down on her shoulder, not roughly, but with an urgent, grounding force. "Easy now," a low voice rumbled, cutting through the fog of her dream. "You're safe. Wake up." Her eyes flew open. The room was pitch black, but she could feel him there, kneeling beside her cot. She was trembling violently, her nightgown damp with cold sweat. The nightmare still clung to her, its phantom horrors making her gasp for breath. "It was a dream," she stammered, her voice shaking. He did not reply immediately. The hand on her shoulder remained, a steady point of contact in the terrifying darkness. Then, in a motion that seemed to surprise them both, he shifted. His other arm came around her, pulling her upright against his chest. It was not a gentle or romantic embrace, but an instinctual, protective one, the way one might hold a frightened child or a spooked animal. He simply held her, his solid frame a bulwark against the terrors of the night, one hand pressing her head against his shoulder. Evelyn went rigid. This was the first time they had touched since he had taken her hand in the street. She was pressed against the hard muscle of his chest, her cheek against the rough fabric of his nightshirt. She could smell the faint, clean scent of soap and leather and the man himself. She could feel the slow, steady beat of his heart beneath her ear, a stark contrast to the frantic hammering of her own. The remnants of the nightmare receded, replaced by a new, more potent shock, the solid reality of his presence. The unexpected and forbidden intimacy of his touch sent a tremor through her that had nothing to do with fear. He had broken his own rules. He had crossed the invisible line he had drawn between them. She didn't pull away, and he didn't let go. They remained there for a long moment in the absolute darkness, two strangers bound by a nightmare, the silence of the room now charged with a new, unspoken tension. Her heart was pounding, not from the dream, but from the bewildering, powerful feeling of being held by the silent man of the wilderness. The night of the dream changed nothing, and yet it changed everything. On the surface, their silent routine resumed as if unbroken. Evelyn rose in the pre-dawn chill. Lucas ate his breakfast in stony silence, and the vast, empty chasm of the day opened between them once more. But the memory of his touch, the solid, grounding weight of his hand on her shoulder, the brief, shocking intimacy of being held against his chest, lingered in the air like an unspoken word. It was a ghost of a gesture that now haunted the spaces between them. After that night, Lucas became even more guarded, his avoidance of her taking on a new, almost frantic energy. The invisible line he had drawn between them was now a fortified wall. If she was tending the fire, he would cross the room in a wide arc to avoid passing near her. When he came in for his evening meal, he would wait until she was seated before taking his own chair. If their hands brushed by accident as she cleared the table, he would flinch back as if he'd been burned, a dark, troubled look clouding his features before his face became a mask of indifference once more. He was a man fighting a war with himself, and she was the unwilling battlefield. Evelyn, in turn, threw herself into her work with a fierce, desperate focus. Labor was the only thing that made sense, the only thing that could quiet the turmoil in her mind. She scrubbed the cabin's wooden floors until they shone. She coaxed stubborn green shoots from the dry, unforgiving soil of the garden, and she took to his mending with a meticulous care that bordered on obsession. She learned the landscape of his life through the items he used, the worn patch on the elbow of his favorite shirt, the way the handle of his coffee cup was grooved to fit his thumb, the deep creases in the leather of his saddle that she polished in the barn one quiet afternoon. In her diligence, she began to transform the stark cabin. A jar of wildflowers, plucked from a stubborn patch near the well, appeared on the table. The curtains, once gray with dust, were washed and hung, letting in a brighter, cleaner light. She learned to bake bread that was soft on the inside with a perfect, crisp crust, and the smell of it would fill the small house, a warm, living scent that seemed to battle against the prevailing loneliness. These small acts of homemaking were also acts of survival, her quiet insistence that she was more than just a housekeeper. She was a woman creating a space for herself in a world that had tried to cast her out. And as the weeks turned into a month, she watched him. She learned to read the subtle language of his silence. She saw the exhaustion in the slump of his shoulders when he returned at dusk after a day of riding the fence line. She saw the way his eyes would sometimes drift to the far horizon, his gaze distant and filled with a sorrow so profound it made her own heart ache in sympathy. This was not the anger or bitterness of a hard man. It was the deep, hollowed-out emptiness of a man who had lost something essential. The quiet rancher was a vessel of silent, unending grief. Her curiosity about him grew into a persistent, gentle hum beneath the surface of her days. Who was he, before this crushing silence had claimed him? What had carved those lines of pain around his solemn gray eyes? She respected the terms of their arrangement, the boundaries he had so clearly set, and so she never asked. She simply watched and wondered, and felt the first, tentative stirrings of a connection that went deeper than their shared roof. The object of her greatest curiosity was the one place he had forbidden her, his room. The door at the far end of the main room was always closed, and on the few occasions she had seen him enter or leave it, he did so quickly, shutting it firmly behind him. It was a tangible barrier, a physical manifestation of the secrets he guarded so fiercely. One afternoon, a fierce wind kicked up, blowing a fine, gritty dust through every crack in the cabin. Determined to fight back the encroaching wilderness, Evelyn embarked on a thorough cleaning. She swept the floors, wiped down the shelves, and beat the dust from the few rugs. As she worked her way to the far end of the room, she found herself standing before his closed door. It was made of the same dark, heavy timber as the rest of the cabin, but it seemed different, imbued with a sense of finality. A small, iron ring served as the handle. She knew she shouldn't. She knew it was a violation of the one explicit rule he had given her, but the desire to understand him, to find a single crack in the fortress of his solitude, was overwhelming. Was there a picture inside? A memento from a past life? A clue to the man he was beneath the layers of silence and pain? Her hand rose, seemingly of its own accord. Her fingers, dusty from her cleaning, hovered over the cold iron ring. She was not going to open it, she told herself. She just wanted to see, to feel the one thing that was unequivocally his, a part of his hidden world. She let her fingertips graze the cool metal. What are you doing?" The voice was like a crack of thunder in the quiet room. It was low, but laced with a cold, sharp fury she had never heard before. Evelyn snatched her hand back as if the handle had been red hot. She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. Lucas stood in the main doorway, having entered the cabin with a silence she hadn't noticed. He wasn't holding his hat or his saddlebags. He was just standing there, his entire body rigid with tension. The weariness she usually saw in his face was gone, replaced by a blaze of raw, unbridled anger. His gray eyes were chips of ice. I was just cleaning," she stammered, her cheeks flushing with a mixture of fear and guilt. "The dust—" "You were touching my door," he said, taking a step into the room. Each word was clipped, precise, and dangerous. "I told you that room was not your concern." "I wasn't going to open it," she insisted, her voice trembling. "I was just wiping it down." It was a feeble lie, and they both knew it. "Do not lie to me," he snarled, taking another step closer. He was no longer the quiet, withdrawn man she knew. This was someone else, a man coiled with a violence that terrified her. "I gave you shelter. I gave you food. I asked for one thing in return. One thing, that you leave me to my own affairs." His accusation, the sheer force of his rage, struck a nerve deep inside her. For weeks, she had been a model of compliance. She had worked from sunup to sundown without complaint. She had cooked and cleaned and mended. She had respected his silence, tolerated his moods, and swallowed her own loneliness day after day. And for a single, fleeting touch of a doorknob, he was looking at her as if she were a criminal. Something inside her, something that had been dormant since her humiliation in the street, finally broke. The fear was still there, but it was suddenly eclipsed by a wave of her own righteous anger. "Your affairs?" she cried, her voice rising to a pitch that surprised them both. She took a step toward him, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "Is that what I am? Lucas? An affair to be managed? A part of your household inventory, like the stove or the chairs?" He stopped, his own anger momentarily checked by the shock of her outburst. "I am a person," she went on, the words tumbling out in a torrent of frustration and hurt. "I live in this house. I eat at this table. I sleep in that bed. I am not a ghost you can ignore. I am not just a shadow that follows you around, silent and grateful. My name is Evelyn, and I exist." The force of her own voice made her tremble. Tears of anger and frustration stung her eyes. She stood before him, breathing heavily, her entire being a challenge to the silent, invisible role he had assigned her. The fury in Lucas's face slowly dissolved, replaced by a look of profound, stunned silence. He looked at her as if he were seeing her for the first time, not as the pitiful mail-order bride he had rescued, not as the efficient housekeeper who ran his home, but as a woman of flesh and blood, a woman with a spirit that could not be extinguished. He saw the fire in her eyes, the proud, defiant set of her jaw, and the way the afternoon light caught the tear tracks on her dusty cheeks. The silence in the room stretched, thick and heavy with everything that had been said and everything that hadn't. He stared at her for a long, unblinking moment, his expression unreadable. She could see the battle raging within him, the anger, the shock, and something else, something deeper and more vulnerable. Finally, without a word, he broke eye contact. He turned, his shoulders stiff, and walked out of the cabin, letting the door swing shut behind him. She heard his heavy footsteps cross the yard, heading in the direction of the barn, his sanctuary, his place of retreat. Evelyn sank into one of the chairs at the table, the fight draining out of her as quickly as it had come, leaving her weak and shaken. She buried her face in her hands and wept, though she wasn't sure if she was crying from fear or relief or the sheer, aching loneliness of it all. Night fell, and he did not return for dinner. The stew she had made grew cold on the stove. The silence in the cabin was heavier than ever. filled with the echoes of their confrontation. She couldn't stay inside. The air was too thick, too charged with unresolved emotion. She stepped out into the yard. The wind had died down, leaving the air cool and clean. A brilliant, full moon hung in the inky black sky, bathing the barren landscape in a soft, ethereal silver light. It was so bright she could see the distinct shapes of the distant mountains. She wrapped her arms around herself and walked to the edge of the yard, staring out at the immense, silent wilderness. She heard a soft footstep on the dirt behind her and knew it was him. She didn't turn. Her heart began to beat a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. He came to stand beside her. Not too close, but near enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him in the cool night air. For a long time, neither of them spoke. They stood side by side, two small figures dwarfed by the landscape and the star-filled sky, looking out at the same moonlit horizon. He began, his voice rough, unused. He cleared his throat and started again. I should not have spoken to you that way. The apology, hesitant and broken as it was more than she had ever expected. She finally turned her head to look at him. His face was a landscape of shadow and silver in the moonlight, his eyes dark pools of regret. And I should not have touched your door, she said softly. Another stretch of silence passed. Then, slowly, as if it took all the strength he possessed, he lifted his hand. It trembled slightly in the moonlight. He reached toward her, and she held her breath, her body frozen. His calloused fingers, impossibly gentle, brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek. His touch was hesitant, feather-light, but it sent a shock wave through her entire body. He let his hand linger, his thumb stroking the curve of her cheekbone. It was the first time he had ever touched her with deliberate tenderness. It was an apology, a question, and a confession all in one. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering closed. All the fear, all the anger, all the loneliness of the past weeks seemed to melt away under the warmth of his hand. He took a small step closer, his other hand coming up to cup her jaw. He tilted her face up to his. She opened her eyes and found him looking down at her, his expression stripped of all its defenses. In the moonlight, she saw not the hard, silent rancher, but a man drowning in a pain so deep she could feel it radiating from him. His gaze dropped to her lips. He was going to kiss her. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. She saw him lean in, his head descending toward hers, his breath warm against her skin. Her own lips parted in anticipation. The world narrowed to the space between their mouths, a space charged with months of unspoken words and simmering tension. Closer, closer! And then he stopped. A shadow passed over his face, a look of sheer, stark terror. The vulnerability vanished, replaced by the familiar mask of fear and pain. It was as if a door had slammed shut inside him. He dropped his hands as if he'd been scorched. He took a stumbling step back, breaking the spell between them. The air rushed back into the space he had vacated, cold and empty. I can't, he whispered, the words ragged, torn from his throat. Without another look, he turned and strode quickly away, his boots crunching on the gravel, disappearing into the deep shadows of the barn. Evelyn was left standing alone in the brilliant, cruel moonlight, her cheek still tingling from his touch, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. She had been on the verge of discovering a secret, and he had snatched it away, leaving her more lost and confused than ever before. The days that followed their moonlit confrontation were steeped in a silence that was heavier and more brittle than before. The air in the small cabin was thick with unspoken words, with the memory of his trembling touch and his panicked retreat. Lucas was a ghost in his own home, his movements quieter, his presence more remote than ever. He worked from before the sun rose until long after it had set, as if he could physically exhaust the torment that was hollowing him out from the inside. Evelyn watched him go, a deep ache in her chest, A profound sense of having reached for something vital and finding it had turned to smoke in her hands. She understood that his fear was not of her, but of something inside himself, a wound so deep that her simple presence threatened to tear it open. The land itself seemed to hold its breath, mirroring the tension in the cabin. The late summer heat intensified, baking the earth into a cracked, brittle plate. The sky, usually a brilliant, endless blue, took on a hazy, pale quality. There was a strange stillness in the air, an oppressive quiet where even the birds seemed to have ceased their singing. One afternoon, Evelyn noticed a strange, yellowish tinge to the light filtering through the windows. A low, almost imperceptible hum vibrated in the air, a sound she felt in her teeth more than she heard with her ears. The air grew thick and tasted of metal and dust. Lucas, who had been mending a harness in the yard, suddenly stopped. He lifted his head, sniffing the air like a wary animal, his eyes scanning the southwestern horizon. "A storm's coming," he said, his voice flat but edged with an urgency she had not heard before. "A bad one. Get inside. Bring in extra water from the well and bar the shutters." Without another word, he strode toward the barn, his long-legged pace quick and purposeful, to secure the animals. Evelyn did as she was told, her heart beginning to pound with a nervous rhythm. She worked quickly, her arms aching as she cranked bucket after bucket of water from the well, her hands fumbling with the heavy wooden bars for the window shutters. The world outside was growing ominously dark, the yellow light deepening to a sickly brown. As she secured the last shutter, plunging the cabin into a gloomy twilight, she realized the kindling box by the fireplace was nearly empty. It was a foolish thing, an oversight, but in her distracted state over the past few days, the simple chore had slipped her mind. With the storm coming, a fire would be essential for light and warmth, as the wind would surely bring a chill with it. It was a reckless thought, but it took hold of her with a stubborn intensity. She would not be helpless. She would not be a burden. She would contribute, prove her worth, even in the face of the coming gale. It was a small act of defiance against the storm, against his silence, against the fear that threatened to paralyze her. Grabbing the empty wood basket, she slipped out the door, pulling it shut against the now howling wind. "I'll only be a moment," she whispered to the empty cabin, as if he could hear her. The woodpile was at the far edge of the yard, near a small copse of hardy, twisted trees. The wind tore at her skirts and whipped her hair across her face, stinging her eyes. The sky was no longer just dark. It was a solid, churning wall of brown dust moving toward her with terrifying speed. The low hum had become a deep, menacing roar. She had to hurry. She began grabbing split logs and fallen branches, her fingers clumsy with haste. The air grew thick, making it hard to breathe. The world seemed to be shrinking, the roaring wall of sand consuming the horizon, the mountains, the very sky itself. She had filled the basket halfway when the first true gust of the storm hit. It was a physical blow, a solid force that staggered her and nearly knocked her from her feet. The roar became a deafening shriek, and the air was instantly filled with sand so thick it was like being plunged underwater. It scoured her skin like 1,000 tiny needles, filled her nose and mouth, and blinded her completely. Panic seized her. She turned, thinking she was facing the cabin, and took a step, but her feet met only empty air. Disoriented, she stumbled, the wood basket tumbling from her grasp and scattering its contents. She couldn't see. She couldn't breathe. The world was a screaming, blinding, choking chaos. She tried to call his name, but the sand filled her mouth, and the wind snatched the sound from her lips. She staggered another few steps, her arms outstretched, searching for a wall, a landmark, anything. But there was nothing, only the relentless, suffocating force of the storm. The strength drained from her limbs, her lungs burned, and the roaring darkness closed in. Her last conscious thought was a single, despairing cry of his name, a cry that no one would ever hear, and then she fell. Lucas secured the final bolt on the barn door just as the storm hit its full fury. The heavy timber walls groaned under the assault, and the air inside grew thick with dust seeping through the cracks. He waited, his body tense, listening to the symphony of destruction outside. When he was sure the animals were safe, he made a mad dash for the cabin, head down, one arm shielding his face against the stinging sand. He burst through the door and slammed it shut, driving the bar home. The relative quiet inside was a relief, but it lasted only a moment. His eyes adjusted to the gloom, and he saw it, the empty space where the kindling box should have been. And then he saw that her shawl was gone from its peg by the door. A cold dread, sharper and more terrifying than the storm outside, pierced through him. "Evelyn," he called out, his voice tight. Silence. He strode to her curtained-off room, tore the fabric aside. The cot was empty. He spun around, his gaze sweeping the cabin, knowing what he would find. She was gone. "Foolish girl," he breathed, but there was no anger in it, only a rising tide of pure, primal terror. He knew where she had gone. The woodpile, out there, in this. For a moment, he was frozen, paralyzed by a familiar, soul-crushing fear, the fear of loss, the ghost of a pain so immense he had built his entire life around containing it. But then the image of her face, her defiant, angry, beautiful face from their argument, flashed in his mind. Asterisk, I am not a shadow. She had cried, asterisk, I exist. The thought broke through his paralysis. He couldn't lose her. He wouldn't. He grabbed a coil of rope from a peg, tying one end securely around the thick-legged table in the center of the room. He wrapped a kerchief around his nose and mouth, pulled his hat down low, and, with the other end of the rope clutched in his hand, he unbarred the door and plunged back into the maelstrom. It was a hell of shrieking wind and blinding dust. The rope was his only anchor to the world, his only hope of finding his way back. He paid it out slowly, leaning into the wind, his eyes slitted, searching the churning brown chaos. "Evelyn!" he roared, his voice ripped away by the wind. He stumbled forward, calling her name again and again. A raw, desperate prayer shouted into the void. The past and present blurred into a single, agonizing nightmare. He was losing someone again, and he was helpless to stop it. He felt his control, the iron discipline he had cultivated for years, shattering into a million pieces. Tears he didn't know he still possessed streamed from his eyes, mixing with the dust to carve muddy tracks down his face. His foot hit something soft. He looked down and saw the scattered firewood. Hope and terror warred within him. He followed the trail of fallen logs, his heart pounding a frantic, desperate rhythm. And then he saw her. She was a small, still heap on the ground, half buried in a drift of sand, her dark hair fanned out around her pale face. For one horrifying, heart-stopping moment, he thought he was too late. A sound, a raw, animal cry of anguish was torn from his throat. He fell to his knees beside her, his hands frantically brushing the sand from her face. He pressed his fingers to her neck, searching for a pulse. He found it, faint and thready. But it was there. She was alive. Relief so profound it felt like a physical blow washed over him. With a choked sob, he gathered her into his arms. She was limp, her head lolling against his shoulder, cradling her tightly against his chest. He turned and began the agonizingly slow journey back, hauling himself along the rope, one agonizing step at a time, his only guide in the blinding world. He buried his face in her hair, shielding her as best he could, whispering her name over and over like a mantra against the screaming wind. "Evelyn, I've got you. Just hold on. I've got you." He didn't know how he made it back to the cabin. He only knew that he burst through the door, half falling inside, and slammed it shut, finally sealing them away from the storm's fury. He carried her not to her own small cot, but through the forbidden door and into his own room, laying her gently on his bed, a wide, sturdy bed frame he had built with his own hands. She was cold, her skin clammy, and her breathing was shallow. He worked with a frantic, desperate tenderness, wiping the grit from her face with a damp cloth, forcing a few sips of water between her pale lips. A fever was already beginning to burn in her body's response to the ordeal. He sat by her side, holding a cool, wet cloth to her forehead, watching the rise and fall of her chest. His world narrowed to this small, shadowed room and the fragile life within it. As the storm raged outside, Evelyn drifted in a feverish sea between consciousness and oblivion. She was tossed on waves of disjointed images and sounds, a nightmare born of her own memories and something deeper, something that did not belong to her. She was in a train car, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels a soothing lullaby. The air smelled of coal smoke and sweet lavender. A man's arm was around her, his presence a warm, solid comfort. He was laughing, a deep, easy sound she had never heard before, and she felt the happy weight of a small child leaning against her. But the man was Lucas, a different Lucas, one with light in his eyes and a smile on his face. He was her husband. Then the world shattered. There were shouts, the splintering of wood, the terrifyingly loud crack of gunfire. The train screeched, metal grinding against metal. Masked men burst into the car, their faces cruel, their eyes cold. She felt Lucas's body tense, moving to shield her and the child. He was trying to protect them. There was a moment of chaotic, violent struggle. She saw the cold, metallic glint of a gun barrel, a flash of orange fire, and then a woman's scream, a child's cry, cut short. The noise faded, replaced by a deafening, ringing silence. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and something else, something coppery and final. The dream Lucas was on his knees, his body racked with silent, shattering sobs. He was reaching for something on the floor, a small, ribboned shoe, a fallen piece of lavender-scented lace. His face, when he looked up, was the face she knew, a mask of hollow, unbearable agony. A scream of pure, soundless despair tore through him, a scream that she felt in the very marrow of her own bones. Evelyn's eyes fluttered open. The storm had passed. The cabin was utterly silent, filled with the clean, hushed light of a world washed new. For a moment, she was disoriented, unsure where she was. This was not her cot. She was lying in a large bed, tucked under a heavy quilt that smelled of him. She turned her head. Lucas was sitting in a chair beside the bed, slumped forward, his head resting on his arms on the mattress beside her. He was asleep, but it was the sleep of utter exhaustion. His face was pale beneath his tan, smudged with dirt and worry. Dark circles bruised the skin beneath his eyes, and a dark stubble covered his jaw. His hand was resting on the quilt, loosely clasping hers. At her slight movement, his head jerked up, his gray eyes, clouded with fatigue and fear, focused on her. Seeing her awake, a wave of raw, unguarded relief washed over his face. "Evelyn," he breathed, his voice hoarse. He squeezed her hand, his grip surprisingly tight. "You're awake." She looked at him, at his ravaged face, at the desperate hope in his eyes. The images from the dream were still vivid, overlaying the reality of the man before her. She saw the laughing husband, the grieving father, the silent, haunted rancher. It all clicked into place, the locked room, the fear of touch, the bottomless sorrow in his eyes. It wasn't a dream, it was a memory, his memory. A profound, aching tenderness for him filled her, washing away all her fear and confusion. She understood. Her voice was weak, little more than a whisper, but the words were clear in the quiet room. "Are you afraid to love me?" He flinched as if she had struck him. The question hit its mark, laying his deepest fear bare. He stared at her, his jaw working, but no words came. He looked away, his gaze fixed on the simple wooden wall, but he did not let go of her hand. When he finally spoke, His voice was a ragged whisper, thick with an emotion he could no longer contain. "You're too real," he said, his eyes still averted. "You're too alive." The confession hung in the air between them, more powerful than any direct answer. It was the heart of his torment. Her life, her vibrancy, her very presence was a constant, painful reminder of the life that had been stolen from him. To love her would be to open himself up to the possibility of that shattering loss all over again. Tears welled in Evelyn's eyes, but they were not tears of sadness for herself. They were for him, for the terrible weight he had carried alone for so long. He slowly turned his gaze back to her, and in his eyes, she saw the walls he had built so carefully finally crumble into dust. He stood, not letting go of her hand, and moved to the other side of the bed. He did not get under the covers, but simply lay down on top of the quilt beside her, his large frame making the sturdy bed groan. He lay on his back, staring at the ceiling, his hand still holding hers between them, for the first time since she had arrived. They lay beside each other, not as strangers, but as two souls who had seen the deepest wounds of the other. They did not speak. They did not need to. In the quiet aftermath of the storm, they simply lay there, hand in hand, their breaths slowly, finally, falling into the same rhythm. The storm broke more than just the weather. In its wake, it left a world that was washed clean, the air crisp and sharp, the sky a piercing, brilliant blue. Inside the cabin, it had washed away the brittle silence, the invisible walls, and the unspoken rules that had governed their strange cohabitation. The man who had carried her through the gale, and the woman who had glimpsed the depths of his sorrow, could no longer live as strangers. Evelyn recovered quickly, her constitution stronger than her slender frame suggested. But something fundamental had shifted. Lucas did not move her things back to the small, curtained alcove. Instead, one afternoon, while she was outside tending to the garden, he quietly took her few belongings from her travel bag, her brush, her small book of verses, her mother's worn locket, and placed them on the small table beside his bed. It was a silent, definitive statement. This was her room now, too. When she came inside and saw them, her heart gave a painful, hopeful lurch. She looked at him, and he simply met her gaze, a question and an answer passing between them without a single word. They began to exist not as two separate entities sharing a space, but as a unit, moving in a new, unspoken rhythm. The silence between them was no longer a chasm of loneliness, but a comfortable blanket of shared understanding. It was a quiet born not of avoidance, but of a deep, mutual respect for the peace they were so carefully building. Their life together became a tapestry woven from small, intimate moments. Mealtimes were no longer tense affairs conducted in silence. He would tell her about a coyote track he'd found by the creek, or a hawk he'd seen circling the high plains. She, in turn, would talk about the progress of the stubborn carrots in her garden, or a funny shape she'd seen in the clouds. These were small, simple things, the building blocks of a shared life, and to Evelyn, they felt as precious as jewels. One evening, he came in from the yard after a long day of replacing fence posts, his hands and forearms caked with dirt and grime, as was her habit. She poured warm water from the kettle into the wash basin and set it on the table for him. But as he went to plunge his hands in, she gently stopped him. "Let me," she said softly. He froze, his expression uncertain, vulnerable. She took his large, calloused hands in her own. They were the hands of a hard man, scarred and weathered, but she held them gently, slowly, methodically. She began to wash them, using a soft cloth and a bar of lye soap. She worked the lather between his fingers, over his knuckles, and across his palms, her touch careful and reverent. He stood utterly still, watching her, his gaze intense. It was a shockingly intimate act, a form of ministration, of care, that went far beyond the duties of a housekeeper. She was washing away more than just the day's dirt. She was tending to the man himself, and he was, for for the first time, allowing himself to be tended to. When she was finished, she dried his hands with a clean towel, her fingers lingering on his for a moment longer than was necessary before she finally let go. He didn't pull away. The evenings by the fire changed, too. They would sit in the flickering light, the world outside a vast, dark emptiness, their small cabin a bastion of warmth and quiet companionship. She would be busy with her mending, her needle dipping in and out of the rough fabric of one of his shirts, and he would be oiling a piece of leather or sharpening a knife, the rhythmic scrape of the whetstone a soothing sound in the quiet. Often, their eyes would meet over the flames, and they would hold the gaze for a long moment, a slow, quiet smile touching Evelyn's lips. In those moments, she felt a sense of belonging, of being truly home, that she had thought was lost to her forever. They were living as man and wife in all but name, sharing a home, a bed, a life, but the final boundary, the ghost of his past, still stood between them. He slept beside her every night, a warm, solid presence in the darkness, but he never reached for her. He would lie rigidly on his side of the bed, a careful foot of space between them, his breathing slow and even. She knew he was often not asleep. She could feel the tension in him, the silent battle he was still waging, and so she waited, giving him the time and the space he needed to find his way to her. The full moon returned, just as it had on the night of their argument, but this time its light felt different. It was not a cold, revealing glare, but a soft, benevolent glow that spilled through the cabin's windows. The air was cool and smelled of pine and distant rain. Evelyn was at the wash basin, her back to the room, her hands submerged in the soapy water as she scrubbed the last of their supper plates. The cabin was quiet, except for the soft clatter of the dishes and the crackle of the low fire in the hearth. She was humming a quiet tune, a half-remembered melody from her childhood, feeling a sense of peace that was still new and fragile. She did not hear him approach. His footsteps on the wooden floor were nearly soundless. She only knew he was there when she felt the warmth of his body behind her, a solid presence that made the hairs on her arms stand on end. She stilled, her hands frozen in the water. He stood there for a long moment, so close she could feel the rhythm of his breathing. Then, slowly, hesitantly, he lowered his head. She felt his warm breath on the nape of her neck, and her own breath hitched in her throat. He pressed his lips to her skin, just below her ear. It was not a demanding kiss, but a touch as soft and gentle as a whisper. A question mark of a kiss that sent a tremor all the way down to her toes. He lingered there, his lips moving with an infinite tenderness against her neck, and she closed her eyes, a wave of warmth and longing washing over her. This was it, the moment the waiting was over. Slowly, she turned in the circle of his arms, her wet hands coming up to rest on his chest. She looked up into his face, in the dim, moon-dappled light. His eyes were dark with a mixture of fear and a desperate, aching desire. His walls were down, his soul laid bare for her to see. She was the one who closed the final distance. She rose on her toes, her hands sliding up to cup his rough, stubbled cheeks, and pressed her mouth to his. The kiss was everything they had held back for months. It was clumsy and urgent, a collision of two lonely souls who had forgotten how to be gentle with themselves, let alone with another. It was a kiss of desperation and of profound relief, of grief, and of a wild, burgeoning hope. His lips were tentative at first, then demanding, and she answered him with a ferocity that surprised them both. It was a long, trembling kiss that tasted of salt and wood smoke and unspoken confessions, a kiss that felt as if it could burn them both to ash. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless, their foreheads resting against each other. In the charged silence, he whispered her name, the sound a ragged prayer. "Evelyn." He scooped her into his arms as if she weighed nothing and carried her the few steps to their bed. He laid her down gently on the quilt, his eyes never leaving hers, and followed her down, his body covering hers, a welcome, protective weight. What followed was not an act of practiced grace, but one of pure, raw, elemental need. It was a clumsy and passionate discovery, a frantic exploration of skin and scent and touch, years of loneliness and a deep, gnawing hunger for human connection fueled their movements. His hands, which she had thought only capable of hard labor, were surprisingly tender as they roamed over her, learning the shape of her as if she were a new and unmapped country. She, in turn, clung to him, her fingers digging into the hard muscle of his back, anchoring herself to the solid, living reality of him. It was a rediscovery of the body, a reclaiming of the self through the touch of another. For him, it was an awakening from a long, dead slumber. For her, it was a confirmation that she was not a ghost, not a cast-off, but a woman, alive and desired. It was a language spoken without words, a conversation between two bodies that had been starved for warmth, for comfort, for the simple, profound solace of not being alone. In the quiet darkness of the cabin, in the wide bed he had built, two solitudes collided and merged, finding a temporary, beautiful peace in the shelter of each other's arms. Afterward, they lay tangled together under the heavy quilt, the moonlight striping their bodies. The air was still and quiet, filled with the aftermath of their passion. Evelyn lay with her head on his chest, her ear pressed against his heart, listening to its steady, slowing rhythm. She had never felt so safe, so utterly at peace. She felt a tremor run through him, then another. A strange, hitching sound broke the silence. She lifted her head and saw, in the pale moonlight, the tears were tracking silently down his face from the corners of his closed eyes. He was crying, but not with the silent, soul-crushing agony of her dream. This was a different kind of grief, a release, a breaking. "Lucas?" she whispered, her hand coming up to touch his tear-streaked cheek. His eyes opened, and he looked at her. The pain and love and shame she saw there nearly broke her heart. His voice, when he spoke, was thick and choked with emotion. "I never thought," he began, his voice cracking. He swallowed hard, struggling for the words. "After I lost them, Sarah and little Anna, I thought my heart was buried with them. I never thought I could feel anything again. Not like this." The names, Sarah and Anna, hung in the air. Ghosts finally given a voice. He was confessing it all. The truth of the locked room. The source of his all-consuming pain. He was handing her the broken pieces of his heart, trusting her not to crush them. Evelyn's own eyes filled with tears, not of pity, but of a deep, profound love for this broken, beautiful man. She leaned in and kissed his tears, tasting the salt of his sorrow. She held his face in her hands, forcing him to look at her, to see the unwavering strength in her own gaze. "They are gone," she said, her voice soft but firm, filled with a certainty that calmed his shaking. "And we are not. We're still alive. Lucas." She held his gaze, her heart in her eyes. "So let's be alive for each other." A shuddering sob escaped him, and he pulled her into a fierce, desperate embrace, burying his face in her hair. He held on to her as if she were the only solid thing in a world that had tried to drown him. And she held him right back, a promise of a new beginning in the steadfast circle of her arms. The fragile peace they had built in the aftermath of the storm began to solidify, taking root like a resilient desert flower. The love that had been born in a moment of shared trauma now blossomed in the quiet sunlight of their daily lives. They woke together in the wide bed, his arm often thrown protectively over her, and they moved through their days with a new, easy synchronicity. Their shared hope for a future began to take physical form. At the edge of her vegetable patch, Lucas tilled a new, larger plot of earth. Together, they planted rows of corn, beans, and squash, their hands moving in the dirt. A silent promise of future harvests. They worked side by side under the hot sun, the shared labor a conversation in itself. He would watch her, a small, rare smile touching his lips, as she pushed a stray strand of hair from her face with a dusty forearm, and she would feel his gaze on her, a warmth that had nothing to do with the sun. One morning, as she pulled a loaf of fragrant, perfectly browned bread from the small oven, a thought sparked in Evelyn's mind. It was a bold idea, born of her newfound confidence. "I could make more," she said, her voice tentative. "More than we need. You could take them to town when you go for supplies. We could sell them." Lucas stopped, a half-mended harness in his hands. He looked at the bread, then at her, his gray eyes searching her face. In the past, the town had been a source of nothing but pain and humiliation for her. That she would willingly seek to engage with it was a testament to how far she had come. He saw the determined light in her eyes, the quiet pride in her own skill. He gave a single, slow nod. "All right," he said, the word a simple affirmation of his faith in her. "We'll sell your bread." And so, a new rhythm was added to their lives. Twice a month, they would ride to Frontier's Bluff together, a wooden crate filled with Evelyn's carefully wrapped loaves strapped to a pack mule. The first time they rode into the main street together, Evelyn's heart hammered against her ribs. She felt the stares, heard the abrupt halt of conversations as they passed. The whispers followed them like a cloud of persistent flies. "There she is, the one Finch sent packing. Living out there with that strange one, Lucas Cole. Heard he's half wild himself." She kept her head high, her back straight in the saddle, and focused on the solid, reassuring presence of Lucas beside her. He seemed oblivious to the gossip, his gaze fixed straight ahead, but she noticed the way his hand rested near the pistol on his hip, a subtle, protective gesture that spoke volumes. "Mr." Finch stood in the doorway of his general store, his face a mask of sour disapproval as Lucas sold every one of Evelyn's loaves to the owner of the saloon and several of the town's families, who could not deny the quality of the baking. They rode home that day with a small but significant pouch of coins, a tangible result of their partnership. It felt like a victory. Their life was not easy, but it was theirs. They were building something from the ashes of their former lives, a quiet, self-sufficient world on their small patch of land. The ghosts of the past still lingered, but their power was waning in the face of the living, breathing hope of the present. That hope was shattered on a blistering hot afternoon when 3 riders appeared on the horizon. They were not the slow, deliberate shapes of a lost wagon or a traveling preacher. They rode with the easy, reckless confidence of men who were at home in the saddle and familiar with violence. As they drew closer, Lucas, who had been reinforcing a corral post, went still. He laid his hammer down slowly, his whole body becoming a study in tense, watchful stillness. "Stay in the house, Evelyn," he said, his voice low and flat, an order not to be disobeyed. She retreated to the doorway, her hand on the frame, her heart beginning a slow, anxious drumbeat. The men rode into the yard and reined in their horses. They were lean, hard-bitten men with sun-scorched faces and weapons worn with casual familiarity. One of them, a man with a thick red beard and calculating eyes, grinned, showing a gap in his teeth. "Cole," the man boomed. "I'll be damned. Heard you'd hold up out this way after the war. Thought you might have turned to dust by now." Lucas did not smile. "Jedediah," he acknowledged with a curt nod. "It's been a long time. What brings you out here?" "Just passing through, heading for the territories," Jedediah said, his eyes flicking over to Evelyn, who stood half-hidden in the shadow of the doorway. His grin widened. "Looks like you ain't turned to dust after all. Found yourself some company to while away the lonely nights." The other men chuckled, their gazes lingering on her in a way that made her skin crawl. Lucas took a half-step forward. placing himself more squarely between them and the cabin. The movement was subtle, but the message was clear. "This is my wife, Evelyn," he said, the word wife hanging in the air with the weight of a thrown stone. It was the first time he had ever said it aloud. "What do you want, Jed?" Jedediah raised his hands in a gesture of mock surrender. "Easy, Lucas. Just saying hello to an old friend. We were just reminiscing about the old days. The war. Remember that skirmish down by the Cimarron River? When those renegades had that group of settlers pinned down?" He turned to his companions. "Boys, you should have seen this one. We were outnumbered 3-1. Thought we were goners for sure. But Cole here, he's a different breed. While we were trading pot shots, he just disappeared. Next thing we know, he's behind them. Moves like a phantom. This one." Jedediah's voice took on a note of grim admiration. "He didn't leave a single one of them standing. Just walked through their camp and put 'em down. One by one. Didn't make a sound. Coldest piece of work I ever saw. We walked in after, and it was quiet." Evelyn felt a chill crawl up her spine despite the searing heat. She stared at Lucas's back, at the familiar shape of his shoulders, and tried to reconcile the image in her mind with the cold-blooded killer Jedediah was describing. "Heard what you did to save that little Indian kid, too," another of the men chimed in, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near Lucas's boots. "Taking out those 2 guards with just a knife to get that child back to his people? Gutsy move." Jedediah laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Gutsy ain't the word. Man's got ice water in his veins. A good man to have on your side in a fight, that's for sure. But not a man you'd ever want to cross." He looked at Lucas, his grin fading slightly. "This quiet life suits you, Cole. Seems a waste of your talents." "My talents are my own business," Lucas said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You've said your hello. I'd appreciate it if you'd be on your way. You're spooking my horses." There was a tense moment of silence. Jedediah stared at Lucas, the easy camaraderie gone, replaced by a flicker of old fear and respect. He finally gave a curt nod. "Sure thing. Cole, we'll leave you to your domestic tranquility." He shot another look at Evelyn, then wheeled his horse around. "Good seeing you alive, you quiet devil." The 3 men rode out of the yard, their laughter and coarse jokes slowly fading into the vast emptiness of the plains, leaving a thick, poisoned silence in their wake. Evelyn remained frozen in the doorway, her mind reeling. Asterisk killed them, one by one. Coldest piece of work I ever saw. Ice water in his veins. The words echoed in her head, ugly and brutal. She looked at the man standing in the yard, the man who had held her with such desperate tenderness, who had wept in her arms, and saw him through a new, terrifying lens. She saw the hands she had washed so carefully and imagined them holding a knife, doing the grim work the man had described. Lucas stood for a long moment, his back still to her, before he finally turned. His face was a closed, unreadable mask, but his eyes were filled with a familiar, weary pain. He looked at her, and in her shocked, horrified expression, he saw his sentence. She backed away into the cabin, a wordless retreat. She couldn't speak. She didn't know what to say. The 2 images of Lucas, the gentle, wounded lover, and the efficient, silent killer, were at war in her mind, and she felt as if she were being torn apart between them. He did not follow her. He did not try to explain, or justify, or defend himself. He simply watched her retreat, his face etched with a profound sorrow. He picked up his hammer and, with slow, deliberate movements, went back to work on the corral, the rhythmic, lonely sound of his blows echoing in the unnaturally quiet afternoon. For the next day, a wall of silence stood between them, a barrier more formidable than any they had known before. Evelyn went through the motions of her chores, her mind a numb, chaotic buzz. She cooked a meal she couldn't eat and sat across the table from a man who had become a stranger to her once again. He had killed people. He had done it with a coldness that even hard men admired. How could she reconcile that with the man she loved? Was his gentleness with her a lie, or was his capacity for violence the truth he had been hiding all along? Lucas, for his part, let her be. He did not push. He did not press. He accepted her silence, her fear, her judgment. His quiet was a painful act of faith. He was giving her the truth of who he was, all of it, the good and the terrible, and leaving the choice entirely in her hands. He was trusting her, trusting the love they had built, to see him whole. The not knowing was a torment. By the second afternoon, Evelyn felt she would go mad with it. She needed to understand, not just the part of him that was a killer, but the part that was a husband and a father, the parts that had been locked away. Her feet, acting on a will of their own, carried her to the end of the main room, to the door she had not approached since their first terrible argument, his bedroom door, the place where he had brought her back from the storm, the place that held his secrets. With a trembling hand, she reached for the iron ring handle. She expected it to be locked, barred against her, just as his heart had once been. But when she turned the ring, the latch clicked open with a soft, metallic sigh. He had left it unlocked for her. It was an invitation, an act of complete and terrifying vulnerability. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was simple, clean, and sparse. A bed, a washstand, a small wooden wardrobe. There was no clutter, nothing of his past life on display. It was the room of a man who traveled light through his own existence. But in the corner, there was a small, unadorned wooden chest. Her heart pounding, she knelt before it. It was not locked. She lifted the heavy lid. The first thing she saw was a folded piece of child's clothing. She lifted it out, her hands shaking. It was a little girl's dress, made of simple, faded blue calico, with a small, hand-stitched yellow flower embroidered on the collar. It was so small, so impossibly tiny. She could almost feel the phantom weight of the child who had worn it. Anna. This was Anna's dress. She pictured Lucas's large, calloused hands holding the tiny girl, his face alight with a love she had only glimpsed. Beneath the dress was a small, leather-bound journal, its pages filled with a strong, masculine script. She opened it to a random page. Sarah smiled today. It read, "A true smile. The doctor says the baby is strong." Another entry. "We have decided on Anna if it is a girl." It was Sarah's mother's name. It was a chronicle of love and hope, written by the young husband from her dream. And at the very bottom of the chest, there was a small stack of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. The handwriting was different, a graceful, feminine script. She carefully untied the ribbon and unfolded the top letter. Asterisk, my dearest Lucas. It began. Asterisk, I am writing this while you and little Anna are asleep. Our daughter has your eyes, you know, that same serious, steady gray. I pray she has your strength, too, and your good, kind heart. This life we are building is not an easy one, but with you by my side, I have never been afraid. You are the stillness in my world, my love, my safe harbor. I know you carry the shadows of the war with you, but I want you to know that I see the man beneath them, the good man, the gentle man. I will spend the rest of my life making sure you see him, too. Asterisk, all my love, forever. Asterisk, your Sarah. Tears streamed down Evelyn's face, silent and hot, dripping onto the brittle paper. She was not reading the words of a rival. She was reading the words of a woman who had seen the same man Evelyn had come to know, the man who contained both the shadows and the light. The violence of his past was not a contradiction of his gentle heart. It was a testament to how fiercely he had loved, how desperately he had fought to protect. He was a man who had been forged in love and reforged by loss. She carefully folded the letter and placed it back in the chest, along with the little dress. She was no longer afraid. In the quiet of this room, surrounded by the ghosts of his past, she had finally found the whole truth of the man she loved, and she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she would not be leaving him. She closed the lid of the wooden chest. A soft, final click in the quiet room. A profound sense of peace, clear and cleansing as a draught of cool water, settled over her. She was not a replacement for the woman he had lost. She was the epilogue to a story of devastating grief, a new chapter he had been too afraid to begin. The ghosts of Sarah and Anna were not her rivals. They were the architects of his solitude, the guardians of a heart she now understood completely. Evelyn rose and walked out of the cabin, leaving the door to his room open behind her. She needed the sky. She walked past the barn and the corrals, out into the open plains where the wind, relentless and eternal, swept across the tall, dry grass. It whipped her hair back from her face and pressed her dress against her, a wild, impersonal force that seemed to pull the very breath from her lungs. She stood there, a solitary figure in the vast, empty landscape, and let the tears come. They were not the hot, angry tears of their confrontation, nor the terrified tears of her nightmares. They were tears of pure, unadulterated empathy. She wept for Sarah, the woman with the kind heart and graceful script, whose love story had been so brutally cut short. She wept for little Anna, the girl with her father's serious gray eyes, who would never get to wear the dress so carefully preserved for her. And most of all, she wept for Lucas, for the years he had spent alone, entombed with his grief, punishing himself for the crime of surviving. She finally understood. He had not been hiding his past from her. He had been hiding from the pain itself. He wasn't afraid of loving her because she wasn't Sarah. He was afraid of loving her because he had loved Sarah so completely, and the universe had proven that such love could be stolen in an instant. His retreat that night in the moonlight wasn't a rejection of her. It was the reflexive terror of a man who couldn't bear the thought of having something so precious to lose again. His violence in the war and his gentleness with her were not contradictions. They were two sides of the same coin, the fierce, protective instinct of a man who loved with his entire being. The wind dried the tears on her cheeks. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple, she turned and walked back to the cabin. Her steps were steady, her purpose clear. He was waiting for her in the main room, standing by the cold hearth. He wasn't working. He was just standing there, his face haggard in the dying light, his expression stripped bare. He had given her access to the most vulnerable part of himself, and now he was waiting for her judgment. She did not speak. She walked past him, back into the bedroom, and knelt before the chest one last time, with a reverence that was almost prayerful. She gathered up the small bundle of Sarah's letters, still tied with the faded ribbon. She held them to her chest for a moment, a silent acknowledgement of the woman who had written them. And then she returned to the main room. Lucas watched her, his throat working, his hands clenched at his sides. He thought she might read them to him, or ask him to explain. He thought she might hand them back, a gesture that would signify she could not bear the weight of his past. Instead, she knelt before the fireplace and, with steady hands, laid the small bundle of letters directly on the kindling. She looked up at him, her eyes clear and unwavering in the twilight. She was not asking for permission, but she was inviting him to share in the act. He seemed to stop breathing. He stared at the letters, then at her face, and a tremor ran through his powerful frame. He understood what she was offering, not an erasure of the past, but a release from its prison, a shared funeral for a grief he had carried alone for too long. Slowly, as if moving through deep water, he knelt beside her. He took a match from the mantelpiece, struck it, and held the small, trembling flame in his hand. He looked at her one last time, a lifetime of pain and a dawning of hope in his gray eyes. Together, they leaned forward, and he touched the flame to the brittle edge of the old paper. The letters caught fire instantly. The flame devoured the graceful script, turning memories of love and hope into black. Curling ash, they did not speak. They simply watched the fire consume the last physical remnants of the life he had lost, the heat warming their faces. It was a sacrament, a painful but necessary act of letting go. They were not destroying Sarah and Anna's memory. They were releasing Lucas from the shrine he had built to his own grief. The fire was not an end, but a purification, clearing the way for a new beginning. When the last ember had faded, leaving only a pile of soft, gray ash, the silence that filled the room was different. It was not empty. It was peaceful, clean, and full of promise. They looked at each other across the hearth, their faces illuminated by the moon now rising outside the window. Lucas reached out and cupped her cheek, his thumb stroking her skin with a tenderness that made her heart ache. "From now on," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, "this is our home." In the weeks that followed, the change in him was profound. It was as if the fire had burned away the perpetual shadow in his eyes, leaving behind the quiet, steady light of the man he was always meant to be. Laughter, a sound Evelyn had never heard from him, began to make rare but beautiful appearances, a deep, rumbling sound that seemed to start in the soles of his feet. He began to talk more, sharing stories of his childhood, of the land, of his dreams for the ranch. He was no longer a man defined by his loss, but a man defined by the life he was choosing to build, with her. As the season turned, a notice was posted in Frontier's Bluff announcing the annual Harvest Festival. It was the biggest social event of the year, a time when families from all the outlying ranches and homesteads came together to celebrate the end of a successful growing season. Evelyn assumed they would ignore it, as they ignored all the town's affairs. Their life was here, on the ranch. But one evening, Lucas turned to her, a serious expression on his face. "The festival is on Saturday," he said. "I think we should go." Evelyn's heart faltered. Go into town? Into the heart of the crowd that had shamed her, the people who whispered behind her back. The thought filled her with a familiar, cold dread. "We don't have to, Lucas," she said quietly. "There's nothing for us there." "There is," he insisted, taking her hand. "There's us. It's time we stopped living like we're in hiding. I want them to see you, not as Finch's cast off, but as my wife, the mistress of my ranch. I want to walk beside you in the open, with my head held high." He squeezed her hand. "With you?" His conviction gave her strength. On Saturday, she put on her best dress, a simple blue calico she had sewn herself, and for the first time, she braided a ribbon into her hair. Lucas wore a clean shirt and looked at her with such open, undisguised pride that it made her blush. As they rode into Frontier's Bluff, it was as if they were arriving in a different town. The dusty, quiet street she remembered was transformed. Colorful bunting was strung between the buildings. The sound of a fiddle sawed through the air, and the street was thronged with people. The smell of roasted meat and fresh-baked pies filled the air. Their arrival, as always, caused a stir. A path seemed to clear for them as they dismounted, and the familiar whispers followed them like a trail of smoke. But this time, Lucas didn't ignore them. He tethered their horses, then turned and offered Evelyn his arm, a formal, courtly gesture that made a statement all its own. She took it, her hand trembling slightly, and they walked into the thick of the crowd. For a while, it seemed his bold presence was enough to keep the worst of the gossip at bay. They were met with nods, some grudging, some genuinely curious. They bought a cup of cider and stood listening to the music, two quiet figures who were determinedly, stubbornly, a part of the celebration. But the cruelty of a small town, like a festering sore, could not be so easily cleansed. As they passed a group of women standing near the church, one of them, a woman whose face was perpetually pinched in disapproval, spoke in a stage whisper that was designed to carry, "Well, Look at that, the second-hand bride, thinking she's a grand lady now. Another woman chimed in with a cruel titter. Finch is cast off. He certainly knew damaged goods when he saw them. The words struck Evelyn with the force of a physical blow. The old, familiar shame washed over her, hot and suffocating. Her face burned, her vision blurred, and her first instinct was to do what she had always done, bow her head, make herself small, and disappear. She lowered her gaze to the dusty ground, wishing it would swallow her whole. But the arm she was holding went rigid. Lucas stopped. He did not pull her away. He did not shout at the women. Instead, he gently took his arm from hers and took her hand, his strong fingers lacing through her own. Then, he turned. He turned them both to face the women, to face the entire, suddenly silent crowd that had stopped to watch. He stood there for a moment, his gaze sweeping over the gawking faces, his expression not angry, but filled with a formidable, quiet power. He looked at the women who had spoken, and they shrank back, their smirks faltering under the weight of his stare. When he finally spoke, his voice was not loud, but it carried with an absolute clarity to every corner of the street. This woman, he said, his grip tightening on Evelyn's hand, a solid anchor in her sea of shame, is the reason I'm still alive. He paused, letting the words sink in, letting the crowd absorb the raw, shocking honesty of his declaration. He looked from face to face, his eyes challenging them. Does anyone else feel qualified to insult her? A profound, stunned silence fell over the festival. The fiddle music faltered and died. No one moved. The women who had taunted her were pale, their mouths agape. Mr. Finch, who had been observing from the steps of his store, suddenly found the toe of his boot to be of immense interest. Lucas had not defended her honor with threats or violence. He had defended it with the unassailable truth of his own broken heart, and in doing so, had exposed the pathetic, bloodless cruelty of their gossip. He had reframed her not as a woman who was cast off and taken in, but as a woman whose strength had saved a man from his own despair. He held the silence for another long moment, his gaze daring anyone to speak. No one did. Then, still holding her hand, he turned his back on the silenced town. He began to walk, leading her away from the crowd, his head held high. Evelyn, her own head now lifted, walked beside him, a queen leaving a court of stunned and humbled fools. They didn't need to stay. Their statement had been made. They walked to their horses, two solitary figures who had faced the world together and won. They rode back from Frontier's Bluff in the fading light, the setting sun casting long, dramatic shadows behind them. The silence that accompanied them was not the tense, brittle quiet of their early days, but a deep, resonant peace. The sounds of the prairie, the whisper of the wind through the grass, the distant cry of a nighthawk, the steady rhythm of their horses' hooves, seemed to welcome them home. Evelyn leaned her head against Lucas's broad back, her arm wrapped securely around his waist, feeling the steady rise and fall of his chest with each breath. She was not a cast-off. She was not a leftover. She was the woman he had claimed in front of the world, the reason he was still alive. When they reached the cabin, he dismounted and lifted her down from the saddle, his hands lingering at her waist. In the soft, purple twilight, they simply stood there for a moment, looking at each other. The small, sturdy cabin behind them no longer a refuge from the world, but a kingdom of their own making. Inside, the fire was banked low, casting a warm, gentle glow on the familiar room. The tension and triumph of the day, the long ride home, the sheer, overwhelming emotion of it all, finally caught up with Evelyn. As Lucas barred the door, shutting out the rest of the world, a sob caught in her throat. He turned instantly, his face etched with concern, and in 2 long strides, he was before her. "Evelyn, what is it?" The dam of her composure, held so firmly in place all day, finally broke. The tears came. Not the hot tears of shame or the cold tears of fear, but a flood of pure, cathartic relief. She fell against his chest, her hands clutching the rough fabric of his shirt, and wept with an abandon she hadn't allowed herself since she was a child. He immediately wrapped his arms around her, holding her tightly, his hand coming up to stroke her hair as he absorbed the force of her storm. "I thought," she choked out, her words muffled against his chest. "I thought I would always be that person. The girl left in the street, the leftover. I thought that shame would follow me forever." He held her away from him slightly, his hands framing her face, his thumbs gently wiping the tears from her cheeks. His gray eyes, so often a mask of pain or caution, were clear and filled with a fierce, unwavering tenderness. "Look at me," he said, his voice low and firm. She met his gaze, and the strength she saw there stilled her trembling. "That girl doesn't exist anymore. The person I see is the strongest woman I have ever known, the woman who faced down death in a storm and loneliness in this cabin, the woman who taught a dead man how to live again." He leaned down and pressed a soft, lingering kiss to her forehead, a kiss that felt like a benediction, a sacred vow. "Don't you ever think you are a leftover," he whispered, his breath warm against her skin. "After Sarah and Anna, I stopped believing in anything, not in God, not in goodness, not in tomorrow. Nothing." He pulled back just enough to look deep into her eyes, his own shining with an emotion so powerful it took her breath away. "You, Evelyn, you are the only miracle I can believe in anymore." His words healed the last of her old wounds, sealing them not with a scar, but with the pure, unadulterated light of his love. She reached up, her hands tangling in his dark hair, and pulled his face down to hers. Their kiss was not like the first, desperate one, nor was it like the passionate, hungry joining that had followed. This was a kiss of profound gratitude, of absolute trust. It was slow and deep, a rediscovery of a landscape they now both knew by heart. He led her to the wide bed, and their coming together was a slow, reverent act of worship. This time, there was no clumsiness, no frantic hunger to erase the loneliness. There was only a deliberate, patient exploration, a savoring of every touch, every glance, every breath. They moved together with a newfound confidence, the certain knowledge of being wholly seen, wholly accepted, and wholly loved. It was a joining not of two broken halves, but of two whole people choosing to build a life from the wreckage of their pasts. They took their time, mapping the terrain of each other's bodies in the soft firelight, their lovemaking a silent, beautiful conversation that lasted long into the quiet, peaceful night. The winter that followed was harsh, but inside the cabin, there was only warmth. Their love became the hearth around which their lives revolved. But it was the spring that truly marked their new beginning. It arrived as it always did in that unforgiving land, not as a gentle transition, but as a fierce, sudden explosion of life. The vast, brown plains blushed with a faint, hopeful green. Tiny, resilient wildflowers pushed their way through the hard-packed earth, dotting the landscape with splashes of purple and yellow. The air grew soft and smelled of damp soil and new growth. Their own lives mirrored the season's rebirth. Evelyn, her face glowing with health and happiness, knelt in her expanded garden, pressing tiny seedlings into the rich, dark earth. Each seed she planted was a prayer, a quiet act of faith in the future, in the seasons to come, in the life that was growing and thriving within the sanctuary they had built. One morning, she came outside to find Lucas standing near the cabin, a measuring line in his hand, a thoughtful expression on his face. He was pacing out a new foundation at the side of the house. "What are you doing?" she asked, a smile playing on her lips. He looked up at her, his gaze dropping for a moment to her still flat belly, a look of such profound hope in his eyes that it made her heart swell. "This house is big enough for two," he said, his voice full of a quiet, joyful purpose. "But it might not be big enough for 3 or 4. A man needs to plan ahead." He was building a new room, He was building a nursery. He was building a future for the family he now dared to believe in. As she watched him work, his muscles moving with the easy strength she knew so well, sawing timber and laying foundations, she saw not just a rancher, but a husband, a father, a man who had walked through the deepest circle of hell and emerged into the sun, ready to build again. It was a few weeks later that a rider from the mail route made a rare journey out to their ranch, bringing a single, unexpected letter. It was not addressed to Lucas, but to her. To Mrs. Evelyn Cole *. Seeing her new name written in an unfamiliar hand sent a small thrill through her. She took the letter, her brow furrowed in curiosity, and sat on the porch step to open it. Lucas, sensing her need for privacy, continued his work on the new room, the rhythmic sound of his hammer a comforting backdrop. The letter was written on thin, cheap paper, the handwriting neat but hesitant. Dear Mrs. Cole, it began. You do not know me, and I hope you will forgive the forwardness of this letter. My name is Martha Gable. I was one of the other women on the stagecoach, the one who was met by the blacksmith, Mr. Evans. Evelyn remembered her vaguely, a pale, frightened-looking girl with wide, anxious eyes. I am writing to you because the story of what happened to you in the street that day, and what happened after, is something of a legend among certain women in this territory. We heard how Mr. Finch turned you away. We heard how you were left alone. And we heard how Mr. Cole stepped forward and simply said, "Come with me." And at the Harvest Festival, we all heard what he said about you, how you were the reason he was still alive. Mrs. Cole, I cannot tell you what those words meant to me, and to others like me. So many of us come here with nothing but a desperate hope, and we are treated like livestock, to be accepted or rejected on a whim. We learn to make ourselves small, to be grateful for whatever scraps of a life we are given. But you did not break. You endured. You did more than endure. You built a life. You found love. Your story is whispered from one lonely homestead to another, a small spark of defiance. It tells us that being cast off is not the end of the story. It tells us that there can be dignity and hope, even for us. I wanted to write and thank you. Thank you for surviving for us. Thank you for showing us what is possible. You have given a voice to our quiet sisterhood. With the greatest respect. Martha Gable. Evelyn folded the letter, her hands trembling. The small, isolated world she had built with Lucas, which had felt like her own private miracle, had sent ripples out into the vast, lonely wilderness. Her quiet survival had become a beacon. She was not just Evelyn Cole, a rancher's wife. She was a symbol of hope for a silent army of forgotten women. She looked up from the letter, her eyes misty. Lucas had stopped his hammering and was watching her, his expression questioning, concerned. He stood in the frame of the new room, a silhouette against the brilliant blue sky, the scent of fresh sawn pine in the air, the golden afternoon sun caught in his dark hair. And in that moment, he was not a ghost or a killer or a silent, broken man. He was her husband, the steady, loving heart of her world, the man who had walked out of the shadows and offered her his hand. Her heart felt so full it might burst, in this wild, unforgiving place. In a world that had tried to break them both, they had found each other. Amidst the ruins of their past lives and the cruel judgment of others, they had taken the broken pieces of their hearts and, with patience and courage and a desperate, beautiful love, they had learned how to make them whole again. Thank you for listening to our story from the heart of the American West. We'd be honored if you'd let us know in the comments where you're listening from, so we can all share in this journey together. Please consider subscribing to the From Wild West channel for more tales like this one. And don't forget to share your thoughts. We're mighty glad to have you with us.